quote, "The political formula Gramsci devised has done much more than classical Leninism, and certainly more than Stalinism, to spread Marxism throughout the capitalist West." What is that formula? Gary North explains. Noting that Western society was deeply religious, Gramsci believed that the only way to achieve a proletarian revolution would be to break the faith of the masses of Western voters in Christianity and the moral system that derived from Christianity. I've decided I'm just going to leave this slide up for most of the lecture because it's the context of the entire lecture. The first quote is the ends, the objective, and the second quote is the means. So it's all there. I'd say we could stop now, but I've written a lot of words, so we'll keep going. Religion and culture were at the base of the pyramid, the foundation. It was the culture and not the economic condition of the working class that was the key to bring communism to the West. To be fair to Gramsci, he didn't start this ball rolling. The West was doing a fine job of damaging its cultural tradition. One can point to elements of medieval Catholicism, the Reformation and the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, as I've previously discussed, and post-millennial pietistic, all right, you guys try saying these three words fast in a row. Post-millennial pietist Protestants, as Murray Rothbard so clearly demonstrated. These have all contributed to the destruction long before Gramsci hit the scene. But without these cracks in the armor, Gramsci couldn't have ever been successful. What's our current condition relative to Gramsci's objectives? I could speak to the destruction of the family, the loss of all meaningful intermediating governance institutions, the absurdity of a good portion of what passes for university studies today, especially in the liberal arts and humanities, all of which are symptoms of the crumbling of the ultimate target at which Gramsci aimed. We have this year been given indisputable evidence as to the success of his political strategy in the response by Christian leaders to the coronavirus. Just as one example from Kentucky, and I'll quote, "When I asked Bishop John Stowe of the Catholic Diocese of Lexington what he would say to a pastor planning Easter worship, he was blunt. 'I would say it's irresponsible,' he said. 'It's jeopardizing people's lives.'" I know we live in a fact-free world, but was it ever wise to believe that we were facing the Black Death? In pre-modern plagues, did Christian leaders act this way? The simple answer to both questions is no. Yet we have churches closed during Holy Week. I cannot think of a better symbolic representation of the destruction of Christianity in the West, and such is the success of Antonio Gramsci. Who is Antonio Gramsci? He was an Italian Marxist, more accurately, an Italian communist, writing on political theory, sociology, and linguistics. His work focused on the role that culture and tradition plays in preventing communism from spreading to the West. Gramsci was born in 1891. He died in 1937. He was the middle of 7 children. He was hunchbacked, either due to a malformed spine from birth or a childhood accident. It's not clear. Maybe I just haven't read enough. One of the stories has him falling from the arms of a servant down a steep flight of stairs. Though his family gave him up for dead, his aunt anointed his feet with oil from a lamp dedicated to the Madonna. It's rather ironic. Continuously sickly until the age of 14, a coffin for him was kept at the ready in his bedroom. I mean, imagine what that does to you psychologically. His father was thrown in prison for political cause, and his mother somehow kept the family alive. Prior to leaving Sardinia for Turin and university, he was a nationalist. Sardinia for the Sardinians. I mean, this was just a couple of decades after, Italy consolidated into a country as Germany did at the same time. Upon arriving in Turin, he came upon the automotive factories of Fiat It was here that he found the class struggle, the workers and the bosses. World War I made this clear. 500,000 Italian peasants died, while the profits of the industrialists rose. He left university and began writing. He founded a newspaper, L'Ordine Nuovo, the New Order, with its first issue delivered on May Day, 1919. He was a founder and leader of the Communist Party of Italy, and he was a member of parliament. With parliamentary immunity suspended by Mussolini, he was sent to prison. Several years later, a prisoner exchange was proposed by the Vatican. Send Gramsci to Moscow in exchange for a group of priests imprisoned in the Soviet Union. Mussolini put a stop to these negotiations in early 1933. It was during his time in prison when he wrote his famous prison notebooks, describing the contents as everything that concerns people. It comprised over 2,800 handwritten pages. 21 of the notebooks bear the stamp of prison authorities. Given the risk of censorship, he used bland terms in place of traditional Marxist terminology. Though completed by 1935, these were only published in the years from 1948 to 1951, not in English until the 1970s. By 1957, nearly 400,000 copies had been sold, and my sense is that's a lot. Suffering from various heart, respiratory, and digestive diseases, he was eventually transferred to a prison hospital facility. On April 25, 1937, the same day that he received news that he would be released, he suffered a cerebral hemorrhage and he died 2 days later. Through his notebooks, he introduced several ideas in Marxist theory, critical theory, and educational theory. Most important was the idea of cultural hegemony, which was the unifying idea of Gramsci's work from 1917 until he died. So what is cultural hegemony? Why hadn't the Marxist revolution swept the West by the early 20th century? Gramsci suggested that capitalists did not maintain control simply coercively, as Marx would describe it, but also ideologically. The values of the bourgeoisie were the common values of all. These values helped to maintain the status quo and limited any possibility of revolution. While Lenin felt culture was ancillary to political objectives, as do many libertarians, Gramsci saw culture as the key. The working class would need to develop a culture of its own, separate and distinct from the common values of the larger society. Control their beliefs and you control the people. This was only possible if the hegemony of the ruling class was in crisis. John Comet expands on this point. Hegemony is described as an order diffused throughout society in all institutional and private manifestations. All tastes, morality, customs, including religious and political principles, are infused with this spirit. This tone is set from the top, one class or group over the other classes. From Comet, quote, "The fundamental assumption behind Gramsci's view of hegemony is that the working class, before it seizes state power, must establish its claim to be a ruling class in political, cultural, and ethical fields." There are three phases to the revolution in this regard. First is to take claim to be the ruling class in culture. Second is to seize state power. And the third is to transform completely the economic base. You can decide how far along we are in this path. A second important idea was Gramsci's focus on intellectuals. Gramsci believed that the working class would have to develop their own intellectuals with values that were critical of the status quo. This would require the takeover of the educational establishments and institutions. These intellectuals, through the educational establishment and the state, had almost a free rein to push forward the revolutionary idea. Gramsci's idea of intellectuals is much broader than academicians and the like. From the book, Gramsci's Politics by Anne Sassoon, Gramsci identifies two groups of these intellectuals: organic intellectuals coming from the working class, and traditional intellectuals, the clergy, philosophers, and academicians. This latter group presented a false air of continuity from their predecessors. Today, I would include thought leaders from entertainment, sports, business, and politics into one or the other of these groups. Gramsci is the foundational theorist for what we now call cultural Marxism. When it comes to the importance of culture and the value of mass media in influencing the political and economic system of a country and economy, Gramsci's work spurred the growth of an entire movement in the field of cultural studies. Gary North describes Gramsci as the most important anti-Marxist theorist ever to come out of the Marxist movement. He was anti-Marxist because, unlike Marx, he did not place the mode of production at the center of social development. Paul Picone furthers this point. Gramsci's vision contradicted official Marxist-Leninist ideology, providing an ethical and subjective dimension superior to the former's materialism. Many libertarians, like Marx, are equally focused on the mode of production as the key to liberty. But on the other side of the coin, they are focused on economic freedom as the means to deliver liberty for all, and like Marx, they virtually ignore or even despise any cultural aspects. Gramsci knew better, and as should be obvious by the comparison I'm drawing, he offers a lesson for all libertarians who believe that broader cultural questions beyond the non-aggression principle are irrelevant for liberty. Continuing with North, Gramsci argued, and the Frankfurt School followed his lead, that the way for Marxists to transform the West was through cultural revolution, the idea of cultural relativism. The argument was correct, but the argument was not Marxist. The argument was Hegelian. The Frankfurt School further developed the concept of critical theory. Critical theory teaches one to be critical of every prevailing norm, attitude, and cultural attribute in society. The purpose is to challenge power structures and hierarchies. Spelling out precisely the discourse of tolerance, Herbert Marcuse of the Frankfurt School would write, quote, "The realization of the objective of tolerance would call for intolerance toward prevailing policies, attitudes, and opinions, and the extension of tolerance to policies, attitudes, and opinions which are outlawed or suppressed. Violent revolution was not the answer." From Malachi Martin. While firmly committed to global communism, Gramsci knew that violence would fail to win the West. American workers would never declare war on their middle-class neighbors as long as they shared common Christian values. Gramsci agreed with Lenin that there was an inner force in man, driving him to the workers' paradise. But he felt that the assumptions underlying this Marxian view were too basic and gratuitous. Yes, the great mass of the world's population was made up of workers, but this was insufficient, as Martin would write. What became clear to Gramsci, What became clear to Gramsci, however, was that nowhere, and especially not in Christian Europe, did the workers of the world see themselves as separated from the ruling classes by an ideological chasm. These workers would not rise up against their co-religionists, those with whom they shared culture, custom, and tradition. They would certainly not offer a violent overthrow as long as these traditions were held in common. Gramsci found the logic of Marx, as it found its home in Lenin, to be futile and contradictory. Was it any wonder that the only state in which Marxism took hold was the state which held it together by force and terror? Without changing that formula, Marxism would have no future. A common culture grounded in Christianity would always stand in the way, requiring ever-increasing terror, or requiring a different path, Gramsci's path.